So probably most of you know about the recent tragedy with Alexander from the SkepticFeminist. He apparently killed his girlfriend, and we still don't know for certain all the details. I listened to a couple of videos, most notably Paul Elam's Ear for Men video, where he heavily criticized T.J. Kirk, formerly known as the Amazing Atheist, and I want to give my thought on the matter. Now, before that, I want to say that I have quite a lot of respect for the men's rights movement. I consider many of them to be simply brilliant thinkers, but I've noticed time and time again that there is a line that they don't want to cross, which is talking about negative aspects of the nature of men. They brought up quite a lot of awareness regarding how a man would be pushed into acting destructively, such as, for example, the abuse they face in life from their parents or from their partner, from the laws that are against them, from the society that make them disposable, etc. And they pretty much stop there, because if they go further, they may recognize that their movement might actually be impeded because the reality is actually even more complicated than even these factors. Paul Elam is actually one of the very few MRAs who tends to be quite balanced in his podcasts, much more so than, for example, the honey badgers. While he very harshly criticizes the bad behaviors of women, he also criticizes the irresponsibilities of men. And this makes me respect him very much. I'm not saying that you have to bring up any fault of men when you talk about this culture of gynocentrism, which determined male disposability. I understand it when the honey badgers mentioned that for too long men are being blamed, they're demonized, and basically it's time for women to catch up. Now, with that in mind, in my opinion, when you're trying to disseminate information on such a serious topic, being balanced, considering and recognize different sides of the issue as much as you can, is always better than skip doing that. Paul Elam earned my respect by not skipping doing that in many, if not most, of his videos, which is why I was excessively annoyed that in this particular response of his addressing T.J. Kirk, it's almost out of character for him to be so biased and inconsiderate in what he says. So let me just sum up both of what T.J. Kirk said in his video and what Paul said in response to T.J.'s video. You can feel free to verify my take on them by watching both videos linked below. But essentially, after the tragedy, T.J. Kirk made a quick video warning the anti-feminists to not use the tragedy to attack the feminist, and they should actually show some respect for the tragedy. He then gave an account regarding what he thought why the tragedy happened based on his own investigation. He is convinced that Alexander has some issues with his girlfriend Heather, the issues being that he probably wanted to make their relationship permanent. He doesn't like the current situation that his girlfriend is polyamorous, and he even gets into kind of a fit at her guy friends whenever he sees her hanging out with them. Now, Heather is not really on board with this, and it just seems that she rejects him, which ends up affecting him a lot. He's also on drugs, and he was mentally unstable when the incident happened. Heather tried to calm him down during the incident, but apparently he became crazy and delusional that she wanted to harm him, and then he shot her. TJ then expressed his sympathy for the deceased, Heather, because from what he could find out, she seems to be a very nice, decent person, and TJ thinks that she did not deserve what had happened to her. TJ then decided to donate money to the National Coalition for Domestic Violence, At this point, TJ understood that the MRAs would mostly have a problem with this, so he explained his actions by saying that he couldn't actually find an organization that equally focuses on male victims, but since this time the victim is a woman, he believed that he was doing a good thing. Now, Paul Elam, of course, had a huge problem with this. He categorized TJ as one of those anti-feminists who doesn't actually give a shit about men. They're just using these issues, these controversial issues, for entertainment values. The reason why Paul thinks this is because of basically TJ's decision to donate to the National Coalition on Domestic Violence. And apparently this organization uses the Luth model, which is very damaging to men. And Paul also has a problem with the fact that TJ believes Heather to be a genuine victim of domestic violence in this case, or something close to it, and that TJ did not consider the fact that Alexander is also a victim in this tragedy. The reason why Paul thinks that Alexander is also a victim in this tragedy is from Paul's interaction with Alexander once, and Paul's impression of Alexander is that he seems to be one of those people, one of those feminists who are actually decent. And also Paul found out that Alexander is a veteran. So Paul Elam deduces that Alexander is probably on psychotic drugs because he has PTSD, which is something very horrific that often happens to veterans. And Paul is angry that people will basically not show enough sympathy to Alexander and those like Alexander, and just basically see the toxic masculinity in all of this. Now, I really can't believe that I'm going to actually defend TJ in this, because I don't actually consider TJ to be a particularly good thinker. But one of the things that separate TJ from many of the anti-feminists, from what I've seen, the other anti-feminist comedians in particular, is that he actually does monitor his own beliefs. He has adjusted much of his belief system, and I was quite impressed with several of his recent videos. I wasn't impressed so much with the quality of his argument as the sense of skepticism and humility he shows in how carefully he tries to craft those arguments. So that suggests to me that he is somebody who does take criticisms to heart and is actively trying to be as careful as he can with what he says now. And I respect an average thinker who seriously monitors his beliefs, even if in the end he cannot get things right, far more than a great thinker who doesn't do that, even if he gets things right most of the time. So I think TJ falls into the former category for me, so this is something that I adhere to, and that's why I actually respect him for it. So here are the problems I have with Paul's criticism of TJ. Paul is essentially convinced that Alexander is a victim when we don't really know the full extent of the situation, and he went into a realm that is more complicated than what he laid out to be. TJ's account of what happened is perfectly reasonable to be believable. Frustration with your partner due to your rejections, and also your jealousies of your partner's significant others, is a very common cause of many such tragedies regarding intimate partner violence, for both men and women. I want to emphasize that yes, we don't know if what TJ said is actually true, but I'm just saying that it is reasonably believable. On the other hand, Paul Elam went into a complicated realm of environmental factors that drove Alexander to commit such an act. He doesn't, of course, outright reject TJ's account because, he's smart enough to know that it's a perfectly reasonable explanation, as I've said. But he's just went into a realm of making excuses, essentially, for such an action, which can really be used for any perpetrator, whether it's a man or a woman. That's the issue when you want to factor such environmental explanations without factor nature into it. Because they go together. So Alexander is a veteran. From what I've seen, he can't be older than 40 years old, which means that he was a veteran by choice. Paul Elam brought up Vietnam veterans and the PTSDs that he often seen them suffer. It's not exactly a good example because during Vietnam, people were drafted, not going to the military by choice or voluntarily. Nowadays, people go into the military commonly for two reasons. One, they want their education to be paid for them, which if they join the military will pay for their education. The second reason would be they join the military like how a woman joins the fashion industry. It's out of their own interest. The military is something that mesh with their personality to begin with, so they joined. So what is the reason for Alexander to join the military? I don't know, and I don't want to pretend to know. But the possibility that he joined the military because he saw the institution as something that suits his personality is quite substantial. So was he a victim of the military, which gave him PTSD, or was he predisposed? He has a personality that makes him predisposed to have that aggressiveness, which made him choose the military, and then act out destructively when, again, it was triggered by the rejection of his girlfriend and also maybe by the drug. Again, we don't know, but it is a perfectly reasonable to say that it is just as likely, if not more, than Alexander simply being a victim, period. And this is the line that I was talking about that MRAs don't cross. They don't want to acknowledge any negative aspects of male nature, but at the same time, they're perfectly fine with acknowledging negative aspects of female nature. They would even go as far as to reject the notion that men are more overtly aggressive than women and are more prone to violence on the average, physical violence on the average than women. Now, I understand that we don't know this for certain, but with the available evidence that we have, let's just say that it's more likely that this is the case than it is not likely. It also makes sense perfectly, in my opinion, from an evolutionary point of view, because men are the more competitive sex, and competitiveness for a long time in our evolutionary past means physical competition. So it makes sense that physical aggressiveness would be selected more so in men than in women because they are the more competitive sex. The closest acknowledgement of this as a very probable fact from the MRAs is a talk from Erin Pitsey that I listened to a few weeks ago, who acknowledged that child abuse, for example, affect men much more so than women in terms of how they would end up being physically violent. And Erin Pitsey emphasized that because we know this, we need to actually focus on helping boys more from violent homes. Now, what they don't say is that if this is true, that means that the nature of the sexes would also be a significant factor in the outcome. That it is also the normative difference between the nature of men and women which produces different outcomes or different behavioral outcomes. So those differences probably also carry on to other things, such as, for example, how men and women respond to drugs and medications, and also the difference of behaviors that get triggered from traumatic events or anguish. Now, I don't think, let me just make this clear, I don't think women are somehow the fairer sex. I think that there are many masculine traits that are superior than many feminine traits. For example, the male tendency to focus on problem solving and logic and putting their personal feelings aside. But if I am to be balanced, I also think that there are going to be natural negative traits that men tend to have more so than women. And I am rather convinced, as of now, until I see more evidence, that proneness to physical violence is most likely one of them. Yet MRAs want to only talk about how physical violence for men is because, likely they are victims of some kind. Well, let me just give the other perspective. That woman who drowned her children, could have also had some traumatic experience in her life, which made her mentally unstable to do what she did. When you go down this path, you have to recognize that in the end, every action is probably deterministic, on a fundamental level. We are all products of our biology and the environment in which we happen to be nurtured. None of us chose those things, right? So none of us get to choose our genes or our environment in which we're born. So going down this path, you can say that we're all victims. But if we're all victims, then there are no perpetrators. Then we can no longer call anybody really a victim. To say somebody is a victim is to say that there is somebody at fault. Paul Elam frequently blames bad women for their actions to destroy the lives of innocent men, but can those women really help themselves more so than Alexander? The answer is probably not. But Paul doesn't show any sympathy towards those women. He tells men to avoid crazy women, women who are borderline. Who is to say that these borderline women are not as much of a victim as Alexander? Well, we don't know, but they could be. But if men are the victims of these women, then it doesn't matter what made these women borderline. Those women were the perpetrators. Well, the same principle would need to be applied when the situation were the reverse if you set this rule, which is that in this case, it doesn't matter what drove Alexander to commit what he did if TJ's account is accurate. So he has committed the action, which makes him the perpetrator and his girlfriend Heather the victim. If the situation were the reverse, would Paul defend Heather? I doubt it. And please don't make the special pleading that, but veterans are usually men, and, we are talking about individual cases here. And we're talking about the principles we need to apply in our judgment. If you genuinely applied the principle with wisdom, your conclusion should be something like, I don't know. I heard this from a third party which gave a reasonable account of what happened, but it's probably more complicated than it seems, and there are many possibilities of motives and explanations that drove this person to commit this act that caused this tragedy. Therefore, I reserve judgment until when and if I have all of the information and evidence available in my hand. The second problem I have with Paul Elam's criticism is that he believes TJ is on Heather's side because of gynocentrism. I've listened to TJ's talk carefully, and I simply did not get the impression that TJ factored gender into his talk in any way. Again, he gave a reasonable explanation for what might have happened, and in his mind, he believes that in this particular case, Alexander was at fault for killing his girlfriend. TJ did not say that somehow it was toxic masculinity that drove him to do it, but Paul shoves gynocentrism onto TJ anyways, because TJ donated money to an organization which Paul and most MRAs find despicable. He thought TJ should know better. Again, this is complicated. For example, I would never donate to any religious charity organizations, but I've come a long way to recognize that there are atheists who do donate to these organizations who genuinely believe that they're at least helping the people that they intend to help. I've ran into arguments with some of these atheists, and for example, I pointed out that Christian charity organizations in African countries, they do this just in the end really just want to maintain the status quo, so they can convert those poor Africans into Christianity, which in the long run is not really good for their society or really their situation. Now, these atheists would tell me in return that, but at least these people from these organization give food and water and shelter to these poor Africans. So they say that isn't that better than nothing? I mean, isn't that better than these people starving to death, right? So I've mentioned before that there are people who do the right thing for the wrong reasons, but the opposite is true as well. There are people who do the wrong things for the right reasons. TJ has explained in his video that because he can't find a charity organization that equally helps men, this is the best that he got. So imagine if there is a national coalition for animal abuse and they almost exclusively focus on the abuse of dogs, not cats. So any cat that get admitted would have to follow some dog model, which actually in the end seriously fucked them up. But let's say a dog got killed and somebody says, okay, so this organization sucks because they only help dogs, but this time a dog died, not a cat. So I'm going to use their facilities to help the situation surrounding the tragedy regarding this dog this time. So the problem with how badly they treat cats is going to be another fight for another time. Now, I know this analogy is not perfect, as the situation surrounding men and women are much more complicated, but in some people's head, that's probably what they thought when they donate money to these organizations. So can you then say that because they did this, they don't actually care about cats, they don't care about men? I think you would really be too quick to judge if you stated that. So that's the problem I have with Paul Elam's take on TJ's position.